Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay. I'm a volunteer with Nefesh B'Nefesh. I myself made Aliyah with them 15 and a half years ago. And here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that's learning how to read your bills, going grocery shopping and, excuse me, reading nutritional labels, keeping up with the news, getting into an argument, flirting, whatever it may be. But all the everyday things that you do in your respective countries of origin, here in Israel and in Hebrew. As always, we want to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. If we haven't covered it already or in further detail, perhaps, you can see all our previous lessons on youtube.com. Simply type in Cafe Oleh or Nefesh B'Nefesh. You'll see a full playlist of all of our previous lessons. This one will go up in the next few days. And this is our last session before we break for Pesach, also known as Passover in English. And we will reconvene in a few weeks on May 2nd. You'll get an email from Nefesh B'Nefesh confirming the dates. But we are going to be breaking after this last class. This will be the end of what we're calling our winter session, and then we'll start our summer one in May. And today, as promised, I said we were going to do food part 2. A couple weeks ago, we did food part 1, which was a lot about things that are foodstuffs that aren't easily translatable, that you can't necessarily look up in a dictionary. We talked a lot about dairy products. I shared some really invaluable links with regards to cuts of meat and names of fish and all sorts of other things you're just not going to learn in Ulpan or in university or in yeshiva, not even living here in Israel, unless you actually go and do it. So this is a great prep for you. But today, we're going to talk food because we are just about a week or so ahead of the foodiest of foodie holidays when it comes to Jewish holidays and holidays in Israel, Pesach, aka Passover. And so what we're going to do today is not talk about Pesach per se, although we are a bit. We're going to talk about words that come up a lot during the holiday and find their place in everyday Hebrew. Oftentimes we make this distinction between Jewish tradition and modern Hebrew. And yes, it's important to understand the difference between the two. And there is a lot of overlap, but also when that overlap exists, how it takes place and how it takes place specifically in modern Hebrew. So with that, I'm about to share my screen. Again, last piece of housekeeping as always, if you would like to ask questions about this specific lesson we're going through about to start, please write that in the Q&A box. You see that in your Zoom menu screen. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, compliments are always nice, especially for something that you're getting for free. Hi. You can write that in the chat. Otherwise, Q&A, I'm only going to be looking at in this lesson. So let me share today's vocab with you. Okay, so we're going to start right at the beginning. The word Pesach. Pesach, again, in English, we often hear it as Passover. It is the word that's used also in Hebrew, by the way, to describe the Christian holiday of Easter, which is called in Hebrew Pascha. Remember that Christianity appropriated a lot of things from Judaism, one of which is the importance of this holiday. So the name of the Christian holiday of Easter is Pascha, which also finds itself in many other languages around the world and cultures. But this word Pesach, we're taught in English means Passover, and it really does mean that. It comes from the infinitive lifsoach, right? The shoresh, the 3 letters that make up the word Pesach, are Pe, Samech, Chet. And as you see in this verb, lifsoach, it does mean to pass over. Okay, it also means to skip, as in to skip, not like skip down the street, but to skip over something, to pass over something, to celebrate Pesach. We have this line in the Haggadah about Vayifsach, and he celebrated, and you shall celebrate, or he shall celebrate Pesach. It also means to vacillate. I put this verb here both to start in talking about Pesach, but also make it clear you will rarely hear this verb in everyday modern Hebrew. You'll hear it in more poetic terms. You'll hear it sometimes in formal, but really, this is a rare verb in everyday modern Hebrew, lifsoach. Just know that it exists. It is connected to the word Passover. It isn't just a random connection between the two. It really does exist, and it means to pass over. Excuse me, in English. Okay, so lifsoach, you could look this up, conjugate it on yourself. That's the verb. Let's talk a little bit more about Pesach itself, because it's not that the holiday is so different in Israel versus in diaspora, although you may get to experience new traditions, right? In Israel, we have many more edot. Edot, or edah, is a singular one. Edah is a community, and edot are communities. This is the word that we use in modern Hebrew to describe the various ethnic, cultural traditions that Jewish communities around the world have, right? So we talk about Haidah Ashkenazit, the Ashkenazi community, and that includes all of their traditions and customs, or Edot Bnei Mizrach, all the various Mizrahi communities, or Haidah Sfaradit, the Sephardic community, right? So Edot is a very important thing, especially when we get to Pesach. It'll come up multiple times in this lesson. So some of the words are going to be different than what you're used to, either in English or in whatever languages you use other than Hebrew, in modern Hebrew. First off, Seder night itself. Pesach this year begins on a Friday night, a week from this coming Friday. We call that night, and many of you probably know this already, Leil HaSeder. Leil HaSeder is the night that you celebrate, you begin Pesach at the Seder table with the Seder plate and everything that goes along with it. In Hebrew, we call that Leil HaSeder. Okay, that is the night that Seder begins. Remember that in Israel, we celebrate 7 days, which means there's only one Leil HaSeder. There aren't two, like many communities in diaspora celebrate. So Leil HaSeder, okay, that will be a week from this Friday night. And the centerpiece of it, and this is an interesting differentiation, but it's an important one, is the Seder plate, as we say in English. In Hebrew, though, we say ke'arat Leil HaSeder, or simply ke'arat HaSeder. Ke'ara in modern Hebrew is a bowl. Interestingly enough, you can say tzalachat HaSeder, what tzalachat is a plate. But most of the times, the formal way that we say a Seder plate in Hebrew is using the word for a bowl. So ke'arat Leil HaSeder or ke'arat HaSeder. Okay. Again, you will see tzalachat HaSeder, but I think that's more non-Hebrew influence, but ke'arat HaSeder is how it's normally referred to, literally the Seder bowl, the Seder bowl, rather than the Seder plate. Okay, that's an important distinction to be made. Now let's talk about some foods. Now, one of the most important things, if you have never celebrated Pesach in Israel, is, especially if you are coming from North America or the UK, or where English is your native language, chances are you're coming from communities where the majority of Jews are Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim have their own traditions, like I said before about that word edah. In Israel, though, the vast majority of Jews are both native born and come from Sephardi and Mizrahi backgrounds, not from Ashkenazi backgrounds. Okay, the vast majority are Sephardi and Mizrahi. This often comes to a head ahead of Pesach. And I remember very distinctly recently moving to Israel all those years ago and going to the local supermarket and not only hearing a couple people screaming in English, but screaming, why is everything got kisnias in it? Why can't I eat anything for Pesach? And it was this understanding, it's not so simple to just come to Israel and celebrate Pesach, because things are a little different here. So let's start with that. The word kitniot. Those of you who keep kashrut, you know the rules of Pesach. You know that Ashkenazim, by and large, do not eat what we call kitniot, whereas Sfaradim and Mizrahim do. That has changed a lot in the last few years. Certainly in the conservative movement has changed that. Also, a lot of people in Israel believe that, because that is a diaspora tradition, or a tradition that's based in diaspora reality. That's no longer the case in Israel. Whatever you may do, just know that the word kitniot does exist in everyday Hebrew. This is a word that we use all the time in Israel. The difference is important, though, because when we talk about kitniot for Pesach, we're talking about all those things that Mizrahim and Sephardim will eat that Ashkenazim by and large won't. That is not just legumes and pulses as it's written here, but that's also rice, that's corn, that's many other things that aren't included in the family of foodstuffs known as legumes or pulses. Okay, in everyday Hebrew, outside of the 7 days of Pesach here in Israel, kitniot are simply legumes and pulses. They're beans, they're lentils, they're anything along those kinds. They do not include rice or corn. Kitniot, if you look it up in a dictionary, will simply say legumes or pulses, and that's how we use it in everyday Hebrew. Okay, so when you go to the store, you will see the word kitniot used. And oftentimes in the same section will be bags of rice and bags of corn and bags of other things and wheat and other things that may be understood as kitniot for Pesach, but in everyday Hebrew, they just mean legumes and pulses, beans, lentils, and so forth, peas. Okay, so that's a very important distinction before and after Pesach. The next word, because we're talking about kitniot and we're talking about like general categories of food, and that's important, especially when it comes to Pesach, but in general, when we're talking about food, is egozim. Egozim are simply nuts. Okay, any kind of edible nuts. They actually don't have to be edible, but any kind of nut is egozim. And that's the catch-all term, just like kitniot is the catch-all general term for legumes and pulses. And the third one you've probably heard, but you didn't know the difference, was pitzuchim. Pitzuchim comes from the verb lefatzeach, which means to crack. Okay, the popular ballet in wintertime is mefatzeach egozim, the nutcracker. Okay, the cracker of nuts. Pitzuchim are any nuts or seeds that still have their shells intact, right? So you'll often see this word when we talk about sunflower seeds that many Israelis and many people elsewhere around the world love to eat. They don't call them by the word sunflower. They just simply say pitzuchim. And it's understood that we're talking about something that you have to crack open. Okay, this is another term that you're going to see a lot in the next week or so, and in general, when we're talking about foodstuffs, these sort of generic, general terms, the categories of foods are important. And finally, one more, when we're talking about differences in edot, in traditions and customs, is one that is particular to Ashkenazim, and even within Ashkenazim, only usually by Hasidim, B'nai Hasidut, is the idea of matzah shruya. Matzah shruya, or shruya, depending on how you say the letter resh, is what is known in Yiddish as gebraks. Okay, that is that there are certain Hasidic communities that don't eat matzah that has been moistened or become wet with a liquid for fear that it would turn into chametz. I'm not getting into all the religious rules around it. Just know there is a Hebrew equivalent to the Yiddish gebraks. If you thought that gebraks was Hebrew, sorry, not sorry, it is definitely not. Instead, in Hebrew, we call it matzah shruya. Shruya comes from the verb lahashrot, which is to soak. Okay, so if you were ever going to soak something or infuse something or even marinate something, the verb is lahashrot or lahashrot or lashrot, depending on how you want to say that letter. Okay, matzah shruya is any kind of soaked matzah. That could be in a Sephardi pie like minas or maginas. That could be knedelach, which, by the way, we do not use any other word in modern Hebrew. There is a modern Hebrew way to say matzah balls, but we simply say knedelach. So if you were looking for the mix here in Israel in the supermarket, you're going to look for, in big letters, and it's spelled like it is in Yiddish, knedelach. Okay. Matzah shruya, an important one if that is relevant to you. Let's go on. Now, what I did here is I took some of the central words and foods that have to take place during Pesach, and I started breaking them apart and finding words that we use in everyday Hebrew that you also can understand their connections to. So let's start with chametz. We all know the rule on Pesach, you're not supposed to eat or possess chametz. Chametz is any combination of water and one of the 5 grains, wheat, barley, spelt, rye, or oats, that's allowed to sit for more than 18 minutes. That is the halacha, that is the religious ruling of what constitutes chametz versus not chametz. You're not supposed to own or possess chametz during Pesach. And that root, chet mem tzadi, comes out a lot in modern Hebrew that we don't necessarily think about, especially because we don't think about chametz, that word, ever again in the year, which is a very interesting balance between the two. And let me show you a couple places. Some of these we've actually done before. Chamutz. Chamutz is sour. Okay, it's an adjective, chamutz. We've talked about this word before. Chamutz can also be describing someone who has a sour face. If someone is chamutz, they are sour, but it's also meant like someone who's a bit of a Debbie Downer. It's someone who's really sort of down and snobbish towards other people. Chamutz is a great word. I'm actually drinking Mitz Tuv Devan Chamutz right now, sour cherry juice, Chamutz, and that's how it's called in Hebrew. Okay, wow, that was a good key right there. Chometz. Chometz we all have in our homes, we use in cooking, also in cleaning. Chometz is vinegar. Okay, so from the same root of chet mem tzadi, we get all these really, not just practical words, but words that give further illustration, further understanding of what is chametz. Okay, so chometz is vinegar. Okay, any kind of vinegar, by the way. If I want to say white vinegar, it would be chometz lavan. If I want to say balsamic vinegar, chometz balsami. Okay, and so forth. Chamatzmatz. Chamatzmatz is vinegary. We're simply taking the word chometz and we're turning it into an adjective using this very, one of the many ways that we do that in Hebrew is we simply repeat the last or second to last or last 2 letters of the word. Chamatzmatz, vinegary. Okay, chumtza. Chumtza is acid. Right, so we've already talked about sour, vinegar. Chumtza is an acid, any kind of acid. It could be dangerous, poisonous. It could be an amino acid. It could be any kind of acid that or it could be citric acid, whatever you want. Chumtza is acid. So again, the same root is giving us all these different words that are interrelated to each other and to the word chametz. Okay, chamtzan. See how many there are. They keep on growing. How many are used in everyday Hebrew? Chamtzan is oxygen. Right, we've talked about this before when we went through nutritional labels, that Hebrew, modern Hebrew, has its own words for the elements. Okay, believe it or not, we have words for everything, including the elements. Chamtzan is oxygen. Okay, along with that is the verb lachamitz. Lachamitz means to pickle. It means to turn sour, right? To cause to become sour, to cause to become chamutz. We talked about that verb construct a couple weeks ago. And it also means to miss out. You'll hear this word a lot when it's used in sales, in advertisements on the radio and on TV here in Israel. Al tachamitzu, lo lachamitz, don't miss out. Okay, that's this verb lachamitz, to miss out on something or to cause something to turn sour or to pickle. Okay, chamutzim. Chamutzim is the catch-all word like we had before with kitniot and egozim and pitzuchim. Chamutzim is the catch-all word for pickles. Most of the time it's going to refer to cucumber pickles, but remember in Israel, we pickle a lot more than just cucumbers. That's a tradition from Jews from the Middle East. That's a tradition from Jews from Central Asia and the former Soviet Union, as well as in the rest of Europe. It's not just cucumbers that we pickle, folks. All sorts of other things we pickle. This is the catch-all term for that generic, general family of pickled fruits and vegetables, chamutzim. Okay? Machametzet, it just keeps going. This is an amazing shoresh when it gives us all these words. Machametzet is sourdough, as in sourdough bread. So lechem machametzet is sourdough bread. And then finally, a more modern word, chamutziot. Chamutziot are cranberries. Remember that cranberries also exist in Northern Europe as well as in North America. Chamutziot, whether you want the dried ones, the frozen ones. Here in Israel, we don't usually get fresh ones. Usually you get frozen whole or dried in the dried fruit and nut section. Okay, so chamutziot. So from all these words, this one root, chet, mem, tzadi, we get all these words that give us, again, why I think this is so amazing is not just all the practical words we get out of this one root, but also gives us further understanding what our tradition says about what is chametz, right? It has something to do with the connection of chamtzan, oxygen, and turning sour and machametzet and all these other things without further saying much to us other than what the halakha, the Jewish religious law says. Okay, so chametz gives us quite a lot of everyday Hebrew words. Let's go through some others. Here at the bottom, mar. Mar or mar comes from, we know from the Seder Plate, the Keharat HaSeder, the word maror, as well as in the, not just during the Haggadah, in the Haggadah, but also during Manishtana, the 4 questions. Alba Kushiot is how it's called in Hebrew, by the way. And from it, we get the modern Hebrew words for marir and mar. Marir is bitterish, meaning it's not completely bitter. It has bitter qualities, and mar is just flat out bitter, right? So for example, the alcohol Campari, many people would say is marir or marir, bitterish, or other people would say it's bitter, right? It's your level of how you would describe something. Marir is less in intensity than mar. And we see this, by the way, we see this construct used quite a lot. So for example, the word cham is hot, as in weather, right? Chamim is warm. Kar is cold. Karir is cool, right? So you see that when we double that second letter, and then we add a yud in between them, we get something that's slightly less than the full version, right? So if mar is the full version, it's straight out bitter. Marir is bitterish. It's bitter adjacent. It's not as terribly bitter as something mar. Okay. And then the last one that sounds like mar, this is a what we call a false cognate. We talked about this last week, this concept of false cognates and false friends. This is actually a false friend, mar. Mar in Hebrew is also meaning Mr. It's a honorific title. It comes from Aramaic. It is not Hebrew. But mar, you can think of it as connected to the Hebrew word moreh, or teacher. Mar is a nice way to say Mr. instead of saying Adon. Adon means more Lord, or master, whereas Mar simply means Mr., and it comes from the same origin that the Hebrew word moreh comes from. Okay, so Mar simply means Mr., but don't confuse it with Mar as in bitter. You could call someone who's a Mr. also bitter, but it'll be understood if you're calling someone bitter or Mr. Calling them Mr. Bitter, that would just be, it's too much. Too many reshis there. Okay, another one that we know from the Seder Plate and from Leila Seder is the charoset, right? Many different edot have very different ways of preparing charoset. Charoset has the root chet resh samech, and that gives us the word cheres. Cheres is one of the words that we use for clay in modern Hebrew. It's also the word that we use for pottery. And one of, I think, many very cool ways to further modernize Hebrew. Sorry, just 1 second. Sorry, my screen just froze. Just 1 minute. Sorry. To stop and reshare. Just 1 second, folks. Technical difficulties. Okay. Sorry, just 1 second, folks. I know I was building up to something, but just need to make sure that the website is working. Aha. Just need to be refreshed. There we go. Nope, sorry, just 1 minute. Huh. Sorry, just having a technical issue with the Google Sheets. Just trying to work it out as I'm. There we go. Okay. Let's see what's happening here. Okay, sorry for about that, folks. All right, we got it fixed. Okay, let me pull that back up. Share screen. Great. Okay, back here. So, right here in row 25 up here. So cheres, like I said, means clay or pottery. And the word for porcelain is also related, chalsina. Chalsina takes the word cheres, right? Clay or pottery, and the word sin. Sin is the Hebrew word for China. Put these two together, Chinese pottery, porcelain, right? We know that chalsina, porcelain, is a way of creating ceramics that was pioneered by the Chinese. And so it's referred to as basically Chinese pottery, porcelain. Okay, so from that word, we get chalsina. It's a very creative way to come up with new words here in modern Hebrew, I think. Okay, let's move on to a very important one. Beitza and bitza. We've talked about this before. I first taught this 2 years ago when there was a major egg shortage ahead of Pesach, and there usually is ahead of Pesach because there is a run on food. There isn't enough imports, and we know that we're in the middle of some serious global import trade supply issues. So this is always going to be an issue. You may already be seeing this in some supermarkets where it limits the amount of beitzim you can order. Beitza in Hebrew is feminine. It means egg, and the plural is beitzim. Okay, we've talked about this before when there are some exceptions to when the word is in plural, or its ending indicates it should be one gender when in fact it's another. Beitza is feminine. It's just that its masculine, its plural version, beitzim, sounds like it shouldn't be feminine, but it is. Beitza, beitzim. Beitza is spelled exactly like the word bitza. Our next word, row 28. Bitza is a swamp. And here's the difference. Beitza, beitzim, egg, eggs. Bitza, bitzot, swamp, swamps. Okay, so this word you'll never get confused if it's feminine or masculine. It's absolutely feminine. Bitza is a swamp. Bitzot are swamps. Okay, by the way, beitza and bitza, because in Hebrew we don't write out the dots and the bars that indicate vowel sounds, known as nikud. Ha-bitza or ha-beitza, depending on how you want to read it, is one of the nicknames for Tel Aviv. Why? Well, one reason is because of the amount of white buildings that are both Bauhaus style, but also inspired by Bauhaus. And so the amount of white coating on buildings looks like the white coating of an egg. It's also because it's known as Habu'a is one of its other nicknames, the bubble, because much like people who live in Manhattan and New York City, for example, they think nothing else exists outside of it. But it's also known as Habitza because those of you who've been here in the summer here in Tel Aviv, it can get quite humid and unbearably so at times. So just like a swamp can be humid, so too does Tel Aviv. It no longer has swamps. Thankfully, we still do have Yetushim, mosquitoes, but it is no longer swamp weather terrain so much here in Tel Aviv. Okay, this was an important thing to say before, and it always is an important thing to say. We've talked before about possession, how to say to have, do I have, things like that. Though there are some exceptions. This is a big one, folks, so please pay attention if you're going grocery shopping in Israel and you've forgotten this. When you want to ask a grocery store clerk or shopkeep or owner or cashier if there are any eggs available. And remember, 2 years ago, there was quite the run. So you were going to ask before you came into the store because it was also pandemic times. You simply ask, yesh betzim. Yesh means is there or are there? And betzim, plural for egg. Okay, so yesh betzim implies you're asking, because you're asking directly to someone, are there any eggs? Or do you have any eggs for sale? Or do you have any eggs? Okay, yesh betzim, even though it doesn't include any word that indicates you, it's implied. And why is that important? Because if you were to say, yesh lecha betzim, it's a very, very, very different thing to say. Betzim in slang Hebrew is male genitalia. Okay, so if you ask someone, yesh lecha betzim, and lecha because it's to a man, do you have any guts? Right? Like the vulgar ways, do you have any balls? So don't ever include the word lecha, which you would normally naturally want to do, which means to you, right? Because when we say the possession, when we talk about possession, yesh lecha, you have, or do you have? But when it comes to asking about the specific food stuff, you're simply going to ask yesh betzim. Doesn't matter what gender, doesn't matter what store, doesn't matter any context. If you're asking, does someone have eggs for sale, meaning from poultry, yesh betzim. That's all you're going to ask. Okay, don't even think about row 30 unless you want to pick a fight. You will automatically start a fight, or at the very least insult the person you say this to, row 30. Okay, public service announcement. Don't say I didn't warn you. Okay, finally, before we break for questions, a very important tradition. Again, many of you probably have not experienced before, let alone heard about, but is very important. On the last day of Pesach, when Pesach ends in Israel, we have a tradition called Mimuna. Mimuna comes from North African Jewish communities, particularly Algeria and Morocco. It's most identified with Moroccan Jews. And this becomes very important in Israel because, again, the vast majority of Jews in Israel are from Sephardi and Mizrahi backgrounds. And of those, and in general, one of the biggest edot, one of the biggest Jewish communities in Israel are from Morocco. Okay, that is a gigantic population, trace themselves from Morocco. And Morocco has this tradition, and Algerian Jews, of Mimuna. Mimuna was celebrated on the last day of Pesach. It traditionally has lots of different traditions to it. First off, the word Mimuna is also up for grabs in terms of its actual origin. There's lots of people who say different things. I'm sure in the Q&A when I open it up, there's going to be 5 different people telling me I'm wrong with this. Trust me, I've done my research. I've hosted Mimuna celebrations in the past, but you can still argue with me. That's the beauty of Israel and Hebrew, right? Mimuna has a lot of different meanings in terms of the word, whether it comes directly from Arabic or Judeo-Arabic, one of the many pidgin languages, Jewish auxiliary languages spoken around the world, or from Hebrew itself. In modern Hebrew, we have the verb lemamen. Lemamen means to fund something. Mimun is funding. And the idea of mimuna is this idea of prosperity. And in general, whether you believe it comes from the Hebrew or not, it all has to do with prosperity. It also is related to words in Arabic that have to do with prosperity and luck and success. Mimuna traditionally was celebrated by the chametz that was sold off to non-Jewish neighbors, was then given back by the non-Jewish neighbors. And Pesach was ended by using what there was to create all sorts of different dishes. And we're going to get to some of those in a second. But Mimuna was also celebrated and still is known in Israel to this day, being known to open your doors of your home and inviting guests over. Family, friends, but to literally open your doors. And it comes from this notion of bringing in the chametz that you sold to your non-Jewish neighbors and coming back. And so opening your doors to the neighborhood, to the community. And one of the things that you will say, and you'll hear this a lot on Mimuna. This year, Mimuna is going to be celebrated on a Saturday night because Pesach in Israel is over on a Friday night. Friday night is Shabbat. Mimuna is then delayed another day until Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, following the end of Pesach. If you're in diaspora celebrating the last 2 days, you're in luck. It's the same day. It'll be Saturday night. One of the traditional greetings that you give on Mimuna on that night is when you go to someone's house, both you'll say this and the host will say this, is Tirbechu v'tis'adu. That is Judeo-Arabic. It is not Hebrew, and it's not exactly Arabic either. North Arabic has many different dialects around the Arabic-speaking world, and within those, the Jewish communities have their own variations. This comes from the Jewish languages spoken in North Africa, particularly among Moroccan Jews. It's typically understood to mean may you be successful and happy. That's the normal translation. The actual translation has to do with the revach, which is a Hebrew word. Revach means welfare or profit. And tis'adu. Tis'adu comes from the word, is related to the word se'udah or so'ed. So se'udah is a meal. So'ed is a diner, is the person who eats. So the idea that you will be, after this holiday, you will be profitable enough to be able to feed people, right? And that's this tradition of opening your doors the moment Pesach is over and having people over. Mimuna is a big deal in Israel. It has become a political event. If you are a politician or a wannabe politician, you need to be seen at a Mimuna celebration in a traditional Moroccan kaftan, eating all the traditional foods. There's actually a live event that usually takes place on Israeli TV showing it, and you see people making the traditional foods that I'll get into in a second the moment Pesach is over, and you can see this very hurried movement to it because it has to do with chametz that we just was able to use. Quickly start making all the food so that people will come over for Mimuna. It's a big celebration. It goes on through the next day. Mimuna is the first holiday. This is a really interesting fact. Mimuna is the first of what we would call holidays that have to do with a specific Edah in Israel, right? Mimuna is considered a national holiday in Israel. You will see it on the calendars of schools and universities and governmental institutions. It is like Sigid among the Ethiopians. Kurdish Jews have something called Sahrane. There are other ones like this, but Mimuna was the first Jewish holiday that is neither biblical in origin nor Israel history origin. It comes from diaspora. It's a really interesting reconnection with Jewish identity in Israel, and that has become an official holiday. It's also a big deal. People often joke every year, especially Jews who are not Sephardim or Mizrahim, and particularly who are Ashkenazim, to joke if they got invited to a Mimuna or not, because it's, on the one hand, this celebration that's all about opening your doors and opening to guests. On the other hand, it's such a big event that oftentimes people are waiting for their invitation. You can, when in fact, if you know someone who's holding a Mimuna celebration, you can go and crash it. But oftentimes people feel like they need to be invited, or why didn't I get an invitation? It looks really good and a lot of fun. One of the reasons why is that it's traditional to serve a whole banquet of foods, kiyad hamelech. Kiyad hamelech is a expression in Hebrew that means fit for a king. Okay, row 34 here, Kiyad HaMelech. So you will see not just a table very richly decorated with all sorts of different foodstuffs on it, usually sweet things, but also the hosts and guests will be dressed very lavishly. Like I said, in the kaftan, in beautifully embroidered clothes. There's going to be traditional Moroccan music playing in the background. It's a really big to-do. And the central food, I would say, that's found in all Mimuna celebrations, at least at the night one. During the day, it's usually an alaesh, a grill outside, but the one that you're always going to look for is a mufletta. In proper, quote unquote, proper Hebrew, even though it's not Hebrew, it's called a mufletta. but oftentimes you're going to hear people refer to it as a mufletta. Mufletta is basically a very thin pancake, think like a crepe, that's made with flour, water, usually oil or melted butter. It's mixed very quickly and it's almost pounded to make it. And then it's put on a griddle to make, and it comes out very thin pancakes. And you'll see if you go to a mimuna, or just as Pesach ends and it's over and everyone's getting ready for a mimuna, you will see whoever's making the mufletta very quickly, very fast, making these on a griddle and basically taking a whole thing of dough, putting it on the griddle so that a thin piece comes off, takes it off, keeps cooking really fast to make as many as possible. Mufletta are then usually drenched in a syrup, honey syrup, sugar syrup, in modern times also maple syrup. It's a big deal. Mufletta is also slang for someone who's overeaten. You especially use this on Mimuna because you have come to a party that is Kiyat HaMelech. The amount of food there is fit for a king. So it's really lavish. It's really over the top because you haven't eaten enough on Leila Seder 7 nights before. And throughout Pesach, the Mimuna celebration is a really big deal. Mufletot are really a big part of it, and yes, you will often call yourself mufletta if you've eaten too much. It's this sort of thick, drenched, fatty carb thing that you've just eaten and inhaled really fast because you're hungry and you want some chametz at the end of Pesach. Right, I'm going to stop here. These are, like I said, some of the words that we use that are not just related to Pesach itself, but we use in everyday life, like I said, with regards to everything from vinegar to porcelain to eggs. Really important words that you'll also obviously be using in during Pesach and getting ready for it. But I want to stop here and start taking some questions. Okay, Q&A. Alan asks, do people use the idiom lifsuach al shtei seifim? Yes, Alan, that is where that, sorry, let me just open that up again. Right, so Alan asks a great question. There's an idiom in Hebrew that's actually in my favorite dictionary that I've shared with you before. If you look up the root Pesach in here, Pasach, and it actually has a idiom, an expression in Hebrew that goes, where is Pasach? Pasach. Posech al shtei haseifim, as Alan wrote here in the Q&A, do people use the expression lifsuach al shtei seifim, which means to vacillate, right? It literally means to pass over two seifim. Seifim is a clause. We also often use that word in to gloss over, you could think of. But pasachti al shtei seifim velo yadati b'mi livchor. That is the sample sentence in this great dictionary about this verb lifsoach, row 2. And the verb and I vacillated and I didn't know what to choose, right? So the expression lifsoach al shnei seifim means to vacillate, but you can also simply use the word lifsoach. It's a very haughty term. I don't want to say haughty. It's a erudite expression. You don't hear it quite often. Like I said, lifsoach is not a verb that you typically hear in everyday Hebrew, but it's a great one to know. And thanks, Alan, for sharing that. Zahava, how do you spell edot in Hebrew? Great question. You spell it with an ayin. Ayin, dalet, vav, taf. Edot. Okay. Not with an aleph, with an ayin. Okay, let's scroll down. Sorry. Trying to get all of these. Not working. Sorry, just 1 second, having some issues with my computer. All right, let's see if I can get these. Shelly, how do you write Genitalia? Oh, sorry, we have one more before Shelly. Let me just say that. Anonymous asks, what about the word garinim for seeds? Great question, Anonymous. Garinim means a seed. Garin also means a nucleus. But that is all kinds of seeds, also inedible seeds. Pitzuchim are seeds like sunflower seeds that you can eat. But a garin is any kind of seed. It's not necessarily referring to edible seeds, but it's a great question. It does mean a seed as well in English. There is, though, that difference that one is edible for humans, one is not. How do you write Genitalia in Hebrew? Well, it's not Hebrew, but it's Yiddish. But let's see if I can attempt to write it how they write it on the labels here in Israel. Just one second. Having some. See, just 1 minute. Sorry, folks, for the break. Genitalia is usually spelled, though, Kuf Nun Yud Yud Daled Lamed Ein Chaf Sofit. Genitalia, even though it's a lech, because of that ayin in Yiddish is an eh sound. That's usually how it's spelled, and you'll see that on the labels of the matzo ball soup mix. Genitalia. Okay, just 1 second. See if that worked. My remote keyboard is not doing well at the moment. Let's see if that helped. There we go. All right. Genitalia. Genitalia. You'll either see it with an ayin or an aleph. Genitalia. Okay, either way is more or less what you're going to see. If you see a whole bunch of letters that look like this, that's what it is. Again, because it's not Hebrew, right? It's Yiddish, but it's understood. That's the word that we use for matzo balls in Israel. David asks, how would you write the infinitive of to soak? Lehashrot. Great question. Lehashrot. Okay, did that right? Great. Lehashrot is to soak, marinate, infuse. Okay, that is the infinitive, David. You can look it up at pe'alim.com to see the full conjugation of it. Okay. Yosef asks about bittersweet chocolate. Great question. Chocolat Marie. Great question. If you want to say bitter chocolate, or as it's also referred to in Israel as dark chocolate. Choco. Wow, having some issues here. Sorry, folks. Just 1 second. That's not working. Okay, just 1 second. Choco. That's odd. Choco. That's not working. Sorry. Yes, Chocolat Marie, Yosef or Joseph, however you pronounce your name. Chocolat Marie is how we say dark chocolate in Hebrew. Okay, it literally means bittersweet chocolate, bitterish chocolate, but that's how we say dark chocolate in Hebrew. Chocolat Marie, that same word that we had before. Okay. Ahmed. How do you pronounce Lamed? Okay. Sorry, just trying to get this. I'm having some technical issues as I'm going through your questions, folks, but trying to get through them as well. All right, let's see if I can do it this way. Jeanette asks, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are you able to say anything about the origin and translation of the word charoset on the Seder plate? Charoset is typically, we're taught in Jewish tradition, Jeanette means it's the mortar that the Israelites used to make the Pharaoh's various buildings to put between the bricks. And so it's important to understand the connection between charoset and cheres to understand the context in which we're using it. And we further get illuminated the meaning of charoset by understanding the same root gives us the words for clay and pottery, right? Just like the material that's used in mortar comes from the same materials that we use to make clay and pottery, also with mortar. So that's why there's a connection between the two when it comes to modern Hebrew with those words. There we go. Okay. A lot of people asking about the dictionary. Folks, we've talked about this dictionary before. If you see our previous lessons, you'll see we wrote it out in the comments in the YouTube. So please go to youtube.com, if only to review classes here. But once again, it's called Multi-Dictionary with Edna Loudon and Leora Weinbach. Okay, here's how it is. If you can't write it down, just go to YouTube when this shows up and take a screenshot of it. Thank you again for asking about that. Aryeh and Nechama asked, do we have to say melafonim chamutzim, or is chamutzim enough for pickles? Great question. Chamutzim, when you just use it, is generally just cucumber pickles. When you go to the grocery store, you'll see in those tin cans that have pickles, it will say melafonim chamutzim, pickled cucumbers. But chamutzim is both the catch-all for all sorts of pickled fruits and vegetables, but it usually refers to, if someone's just asking for chamutzim on the side, it's referring to pickles in the sense of cucumber pickles. Great question. I see Carol asks a question. If you do not eat kitniot on Pesach, you're going to look for something that says on the label lelo chashash kitniot. Let's see if my keyboard is finally behaving that I can write this. Lo chashash kitniot. Control X. Put it here. Control V. Let's see if I can make that bigger. Excuse me. Okay, for those of you who do not eat kitniot, or you have an allergic reaction to, you have an allergy to any of that, you're going to look for this on the label. There's no need to put vowels on it because there's not going to be any vowels on it on the label. Any foodstuffs you get right now, you want to be sure does not have kitniot in it. It's going to say this, lelo chashash kitniot. Lelo is like the word bli, without. Chashash literally means fear or potential, but it really does come from the word fear. Kitniot, without the potential of kitniot appearing in that foodstuff. Okay, so if you're looking for kitniot-free food during Pesach or any time of the year, this is what you're going to look for, lelo chashash kitniot. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Right, the opposite, by the way, of lelo chashash kitniot will be, let's see if I can, le-och le-kit. The opposite of lelo chashash kitniot, as someone just asked, is le'ochle kitniot, for eaters of kitniot. So for example, if you go to the grocery store right now and you get prepackaged hummus, it is already turned into the kosher for Passover version. It will say on the label this, if it will let me type it. Okay, if you keep kosher and you're looking for food that is kasher lePesach, it's kosher for Passover, you're going to look for this first off. Anytime it says this, you can say kashlap, which is how we would vocalize this abbreviation, this acronym, kasher lePesach, and then it will be followed by le'ochle kitniot or le'lo chashash kitniot. So for those of you who do eat kitniot, lentils, beans, rice, peas, corn, so forth, or chickpeas, you're going to look for kashlap le'ochle kitniot, kosher for Passover for eaters of kitniot, or something that is kosher for Pesach le'lo chashash kitniot, without the fear of kitniot in it. Okay, so even in Israel, where the vast majority of people do eat kitniot on Pesach, we still make this labeling clear for everyone based on their own traditions. Okay, but this one, for everyone, regardless if you do or do not eat kitniot on Pesach, you're going to look for this, kashlap, kasher lePesach. That's how it's abbreviated. Okay. Charles and Miriam, how do you write the infinitive of to crack open? It looks like lefatzeach. Okay, row 43 here, lefatzeach is to crack open, as in to crack a nut. Okay, Leslie asked, do they have matzah brai here? Yes, Leslie. So matzah shruya, soaked matzah, is the way that we would say matzah brai in Hebrew. Okay, matzah shruya or matzah retuva, literally wet matzah, or matzah shruya, soaked matzah. It's not if we have it. Usually you make matzah brai at home, or a kosher for Passover restaurant will have it on the menu. But yes, it is definitely available in Israel. Okay. Lorraine pulses, that's an English word. It's the same thing as legumes. That's an English word. Jeanette, egozim are all nuts. Egoz melech is a walnut. Egoz luz is a hazelnut. Egozim is the catch-all general term for nuts. Okay. Okay. Here we're going to need to break. So, toda rabah, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us during this winter session. Like I said, we will be back after Pesach on the 2nd of May, just before Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, starting our winter session, summer session, excuse me. You'll get an email from Nefesh B'Nefesh with all the appropriate links. This lesson will be up on YouTube in the next few days. And in the meantime, wishing you all a Chag Sameach, Chag Kasher V'Sameach, those of you who prefer to wish as that, but this is one of those holidays you can simply just say Chag Sameach. Have a wonderful, happy Pesach, whether you are celebrating here in Israel, wherever you are in the world, and we will see you all in a few weeks very shortly. Take care, Lihitraot.